Hi everyone, Miss Lerner here. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I just want to say that I'm probably even more awkward virtually than in person, which is saying a lot. I put the W in awkward, probably both W's actually. But as we go through the year together, I hope that you come to appreciate me in my entirety, just as I will appreciate each one of you, because that is what psychology is all about. We are all just a bit strange. All right, so let's go into it, shall we? Usually when we think about psychology, we think about someone who is curled up on a couch, lying down, like pouring their hearts out to their therapist about the secrets of their lives. Okay? That is only one very small facet of psychology. Okay? And we call that really psychoanalysis, which we will talk about later on in this year. In reality, psychology is one of the most comprehensive sciences there is. So we treat it like a science, and this class is going to be much more sciencey than you had ever probably expected. We're going to be most of the first marking period. We will be delved in biopsychology, and we're going to know exactly at the cellular level how our emotions fire and things of that nature. Okay. Um, Besides just the specific topics in psychology, as a science itself, psychology enables us to explain the world and predict future behavior. What is fake psychology or pseudopsychology? Examples of pseudopsychology are going to be things like graphology, which is like handwriting analysis. I see you put a heart over your eye, which means you're very loving. Okay. Subliminal messages that we can control people's behaviors by putting something right beneath the surface. And we do have subliminal um, stimuli, but we can't control people's behavior through that. Um, and if I look at a horoscope or something, right, and I say, oh my gosh, this applies so much to my life that day. That's really not true psychology. Psychology is identifying a hypothesis and testing it out and proving it or disproving it. Why do horoscopes work? Well, something known as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a tendency to pay attention to things that are going to support our beliefs and kind of throw away things that don't. Okay, so usually people will say, oh, I saw a sign that I should be doing this. Okay, it might not necessarily be a sign. It might just be that you are kind of looking for it. It is confirming your belief that you should do it. Okay. Confirmation bias can be motivational, but it can also be very constricting, and it can lead to terrible outcomes, especially when we talk about political beliefs. When people get more and more avid and sort of extreme because they only seek out information that confirms their political beliefs. So, where does psychology come from? Well, the etymology of psychology comes from the words psyche and ology, mind and field of study. And just like so many great things in the world, psychology began with the ancient Greeks. Okay, they believed in what was called dualism, which like the mind and the body were separate entities, which kind of seems very strange to think about. Like, I don't know why my hand is moving right now. My body is totally separate from my mind. But we have a lot of today's psychology to we can thank the Greeks for today's psychology. Okay, the first Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they had a quest for knowledge, and that's really what psychology is all about. Um, Aristotle was the first to kind of to translate this into empiricism. Empiricism is a strategic and data collection driven interpretation of the world. Okay, so he looked at things like sensation, perception, cognition, and ethics, and tried to get some sort of real evidence-based understanding about those things. The ancient Greeks also believed this strange thing that the different levels of fluid in your body were going to cause the type of person you were or what kind of emotions you had. So if you were, essentially having a manic episode and you were very, very, like you had bipolar disorder back in ancient Greek times and you were very animated, you know what they would do? They would leech you, okay? Because that would say, you know what, you have way too much blood in your body. We have to get that out, okay? Obviously, in today's world, we know that that is not the case. However, much of personality psychology derives from that basic understanding that there are several core traits that make us human. Okay, so moving on historically for a second, from the Greeks, we then have a French man named Rene Descartes. Okay, he agreed with Socrates and Plato, and he came up with this idea of Cartesian dualism, which kind of expanded on the Greeks' understanding. The weird thing was that Descartes was, for the first time, a person that actually saw a connection between the nervous system and the body, okay, through his dissection of animals. And because of that, for the first time, we thought, well, maybe there is kind of this connection between the mind and the body, regardless of dualistic beliefs. Then we had the British, okay, Francis Bacon and John Locke. Okay, Francis Bacon is the founder of modern science. Okay, he again did kind of further this empirical attitude. John Locke's famous contribution was what we called the tabula rasa. Okay, tabula rasa just means blank slate. Okay, he believed that, you know, that the mind at birth is essentially just blank and experiences color exactly who you are. In the mid-1800s, we had Charles Darwin on his journey, and he saw the similarities between animals and humans, which he noted on the Origin of Species. And that, again, that likeness really enabled us to start to think more deeply about our mind itself and how we were similar to animals and how we adapt over time, but physically and psychologically. The other major thing that happened for psychology's genesis was that the periodic table was invented. Okay, the periodic table, it sounds kind of like it's totally, unrelated. But in reality, the periodic table is going to strip down all matter into its unique chemical components, into its elements. Okay, and then suddenly we thought to ourselves, what happens if the brain, if the mind is the same way? We can strip it down to its basic core elements. Okay, just ask Bill Nye. So, translating the periodic table to psychology, we have the father of psychology, the real guy that, Big Papa, Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt founded the first formal lab in experimental psychology in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. He was the first one to actually say, you know what, I'm going to put these abstract ideas to a test. Okay. He came up with something known as structuralism. Structuralism is, again, translating kind of this idea of the periodic table into the mind's eye. So if you looked at the structures or the components of the mind, that's what he was interested in. And how did he get these structures or sort of components of the mind out? He had a technique known as introspection. Okay. In today's world, if you say that you're introspective, it just means that you look inward. Introspection in psychology was the first sort of experimental technique where you asked someone to report back their subjective sort of experience of doing something. So press this lever, how do you feel? Okay. Press this lever, how do you feel? Very, very good. Okay, so you get this kind of measured cause and effect type of thing for the first time. When I think of Wilhelm Wundt, I remember that he is the father of structuralism because of the little memory device or mnemonic, Wilhelm, won't you hold my structure? But just as you can imagine, Okay, the first historical school of psychology was fraught with problems. Okay, so you got to start somewhere, but there is going to be some sort of development or change. That's why we had critics of structuralism that were known as functionalists. The critics said, introspection is way too subjective. How can you just disregard the environment and the environment's effect on the person? Okay. So because of this, they came up with a response to structuralism known as functionalism. Functionalism just means that, your thoughts, your mental processes are best understood in terms of their function, their purpose, their adaptation. So it evolved from Darwin in a way. Okay. It wasn't the structures of the mind that were important. It was what those structures did that was significant. And because of this, functionalism as a historical school is now the modern day perspective of evolutionary psychology. Okay. Essentially, why do we have these components of our mind that stuck around over time? How did they evolve? How did they adapt? And how can we actually apply them outside of the laboratory? So again, that is going to be the foundation of applied psychology, which we will talk about later on in this unit. Okay, so just to reiterate the differences, because students frequently have an issue with these two schools, okay, and confusing them. Structuralism, okay, that was the first school in psychology that was focused on identifying the elements of thought and the mind, okay. It was founded by Wilhelm Wundt, who came up with the first experimental lab abroad. Functionalism was a response to structuralism that said, who cares about the parts of the mind? I want to know how the mind allows us to survive, change, and flourish. Okay, and the most famous functionalist was William James. William James' major contribution was that he wrote the most comprehensive and first psychology textbook that was released. It took him decades of his life, but he did it. And he also came up with this school. Okay, so just as kind of a reiteration for one moment, to kind of just iron out the issues between functionalism and structuralism. Okay, if I were to think about table salt, okay, how would a structuralist explain or be interested in table salt? Well, what is table salt? It's sodium chloride, NaCl. That would be a structuralist interpretation of salt. Okay. Now, what would a functionalist's interpretation of table salt be? Would they be interested that it's sodium chloride? They couldn't care. They wouldn't care. Instead, their interpretation of salt is, what is it used for? What is the purpose of salt? So what do we use salt for? We use it to preserve things. We use it to add flavor. We use it to ward evil spirits off over our shoulder. Okay, so that is the core difference there. Okay, the next school of psychology was the Gestalt School of Psychology. And your textbook doesn't really talk about this, but I'm going to mention it now because it will become important later on in the course. Okay. Whereas the structuralists focused on the components of the mind, the Gestalts were going to focus on the whole element being more than the sum of its parts. Okay. They studied perception and perception of the world in a whole sphere. Okay, so that, like, if you're thinking about a face, structuralists would say, oh, well, you have like these, two kind of circular objects on your, up high, and then you have something that protrudes and comes out. A Gestaltist would say, it's a face. That's Miss Lerner. I know her. Okay, and some of these historical schools no longer exist. Some of them inform modern day perspectives, and some of them, are in specific, topics in psychology. The Gestalt historical school of psychology is related to perceptual psychology, which we will go over in the 4th chapter. Okay. Forget about the Mona Lisa. Look at that. Look at that smile. That is very elusive. If you've never seen that man before, that is none other than Sigmund Freud. He's probably the most famous psychologist that people know of. If you were to ask 100 people on the street of a famous psychologist, I would bet that about 90% of them would say Freud. Freud was extremely controversial. We will be spending an entire unit really talking about him and his beliefs. But around the turn of the century, in 1900, he started to see hysterical women patients. In the hysteria back in the day, it wasn't like hee. It was more like I am transforming some of my psychological issues into physical ones. Okay, so Sigmund Freud then would use talk therapy to talk to women, and he would use things like hypnosis and dream analysis to uncover something that he called the unconscious. Okay, the unconscious was this reservoir of ideas and memories and traumas and desires that we were totally unaware of. Okay, and just like if an English teacher asked you to analyze a paper, psychoanalysis is looking deeper, providing reasons for. According to psychoanalysis, there are no accidents. Okay, if I leave something behind, I really want to go back there. Okay, so psychoanalysis was, definitely asked you to look inward like introspection, but it was very different in that it was saying that everything was caused by things you were not aware of. Okay, in response to psychoanalysis, we have behaviorism, which is kind of the diametrical opposite of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis says that your behavior is caused by all these unseen things. And behaviorism is the opposite, saying that behavior is all learned and placed onto you from your environment, kind of like the tabula rasa approach to things. The founder of behaviorism was a guy named John B. Watson. We will learn more about his study on little Albert, which is the most controversial study of all time. One of them. And we'll learn about how he conditioned an orphan to be afraid of things. Behaviorism itself, just like psychoanalysis, is a modern day perspective. Okay, it's objective, it's seen, it has no kind of use for the internal cognition, thought. Okay, because I'm just observing you and seeing what I see. I can understand where you're coming from. How do I know that you're hungry? You're eating. But in reality, that's kind of short-sighted, because you could be eating for a number of different reasons. And when you have a strict behaviorist approach, you discount things like emotional eating, boredom, and all of the like. Okay. And then there was humanism at the end here, okay, that kind of colored into the modern day perspectives. Humanists are the hippies, man. It's not you, it's the world. You gotta be the best you can be. Don't let people get you down. You could be whomever you want to be. You just gotta try. Okay. People like Abraham Maslow and the Hierarchy of Needs, Carl Rogers and the person-centered self and fully functioning person, just saying that everyone strives to be their best self. We can only be there by unconditional love and support. And it's going to be, instead of focusing on the negative, which psychoanalysis did, it's going to be focusing on the positive, how to be our best selves, not moored in psychological disorder. Humanism is really going to be the first, real perspective, new perspective. If we're talking about the historical schools and the order of historical schools, you could remember it through the mnemonic, Sigmund Freud gets people bothered. I'm going to be giving you a lot of mnemonics during this course to help you remember things. Sigmund Freud gets people bothered. That's one letter for each school. So it started with structuralism, Sigmund, functionalism, Freud, gets, Gestalt, okay, people, psychoanalysis, bothered, behaviorism. Okay, humanism is going to be really not really an early school of thought, more of a perspective, but more on that in the next module. Thanks for bearing with me. I can't wait. Bye bye.